Hey everybody, Dr. Dan, welcome back. So today we're going to talk about chapter 16. So this is sort of another monster, kind of hard to read through, but at least make sure that you read through the introduction, look at my reading notes, and then make sure you read the conclusion. And look through my reading notes because there's specific sections that I point out that you should read. So if you read the whole chapter, that's great. But if you can't make it through, at least go through the sections that I'm talking about in my reading notes and make sure you go through the conclusion. So the name of this chapter is Alternate Visions for the 19th Century, and we all know the 19th century is the 1800s, right? So what's happening? Why are there alternate visions and what is going on? As with the typical structure for this book, it breaks these different regions down, and just sort of an overall, like, why are there alternate visions of the world or society in the 1800s? Well, one of the big reasons is because in the Western world, so that is Western Europe and the United States, and South America, but mostly North America and Europe. The Industrial Revolution has taken hold, and what's happened, because now, follow the money, right? So with the Industrial Revolution, you have this whole new class of workers, you have a new class of middle class, if you will, and then you also have the business owners, the elites, and really in the Western world, it's all capitalism at this point. And it's really different from what came before. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, we were reading about monarchies and sort of feudalism where peasants are working the land and mostly farming. Well, now that industrialization has taken hold in the Western developed countries, capitalism, which is private ownership of businesses, has taken hold. And there's this moneyed class. So, there's bankers and there's business owners. And so really society has changed quite a bit. So be able to contrast capitalism to really feudalism. Capitalism is this idea of business, free enterprise, laissez-faire, and the official definition of the word would be something like capitalism is an economy in which private owners or private individuals own the means of production. That's just a fancy way of saying capitalism is like our society or our economy today, where businesses are not owned by the government, but they're owned by private individuals. So that's really what capitalism is in a nutshell. And we read about Adam Smith, before, or at least mentioned him. He was sort of the father of capitalism, this idea of free markets. So that's one of the reasons things are changing, because the people some people are rising up against capitalism and they're viewing it as a bad thing. And as you go through the reading, we'll get to that in a little bit. But really, it starts with what's going on in the Middle East. So as far as the Middle East is concerned, it's not hardcore industrial or industrialized like Western Europe is. So the Middle East is sort of coming out of this ruling by the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Mughals, and so Islam has sort of changed and broken up, and so there's a new push in the 1800s into North Africa and throughout the Middle East. There's a new Islamic push there, and you starting to see the rise of theocracies. So I want you to know what a theocracy is and be able to contrast that to or from democracy. So theocracy is a government that is really run by religion or religious leaders, as opposed to democracy, which is government run by the people, such as our situation here. So you need to know what theocracy is, and it's really the remnants of what was going on in the Middle East in the 1800s are still in place. So you look at a country like Iran, perhaps, and they're a theocracy. So you see in the Middle East countries, these theocracies are even common today, and neither good nor bad, just a different form of government. So know what a theocracy is. As we look at what's happening in Africa in this period of time, in Northern Africa, it's interesting because there's a big push for Islam into Northern Africa. And if you look on pages 602 through 605, it'll talk about how Islam spreads during this period of time. Islam is sort of regaining its footing as the older empires have grown weaker, if you will. So Southern Africa is also developing. There's a person there, a guy named Shaka, and he conquered much of the territory in southern Africa. So we're talking about where like Zimbabwe is today, and so that's changing as well. In China, there's a rebellion going on, the Taiping rebellion, and I think that's interesting because the Taiping rebellion is really emblematic of a lot of other rebellions going on. That there are peasant revolts. There's a strong leader, just like there is in South Africa, who starts to consolidate power around people in the country. And like any of these rebellions, there's a lot of promises made. One in particular, in the case of China, that all the land is going to be divided up and given to individual families. So that's a real powerful incentive for people to follow someone. So the Taiping rebellion's going on, and again, it's just part of this feeling in the 1800s where there's lots of change and rebellion. And then we get through to page 613, and there's a European map there from the 1800s. I want you to pay attention to that. Hopefully you know what Europe looks like today, but if you look at that map on 613, you see that Europe looks a lot different then as it does today. So you'll notice there's no country named Germany, there's no country named Poland, Hungary. Some of these countries aren't going to form until after World War I, which is coming on strong, so that's going to be in our next chapter. But just notice that. I think when you can look at a map from the 1800s and you're like, hey, this looks nothing like the map in the 1900s as far as countries and borders go, you know that there was probably some sort of war or disruption going on because these political boundaries change. Pardon me, my phone's ringing, so let me just click that off. Okay, so read about Europe, but also most important, read about the socialists and radicals in Europe. Page 615, there's a guy named Fourier. Read that section because Fourier talks about establishing a utopian society, and there was a lot of that going on in the United States in the 1800s as well. So it's kind of interesting. You always see these people with new ideas on communes or other utopian type settlements. So read that. Really important is to read page 617. The section about Karl Marx and Marxism. You need to know what Marxism is because it's really sort of the opposite of capitalism. So Marx and Engels were historians and theorists and wrote this, for lack of a better term, this theory of scientific socialism. And really Marx thought that all history would be dictated by the progression from feudalism to capitalism, and then to socialism to pure communism. Of course, that hasn't been the case, but you never know. Maybe the jury's still out. But so Marxism is really communism. It's really this idea that the workers own all the businesses. The workers own the means of production, as opposed to capitalism, where individuals, or what Marx would call the bourgeois, own businesses. So pay attention to Marxism. I want you to know what it is, and it's closely related to communism. I mean, ultimately, in its purest sense, it's communism, but communism, the way it's been used in our lifetime, like in the Soviet Union or even in China, is a little bit different than the people owning the means of production, because really it's the government that controls everything, and the people don't always have a big say in the government. So that's something you need to know. And I mean, ironically, I think China is probably the biggest communist country, but their model of communism is infused with a lot of capitalism and some private ownership as well, only government control. So it's sort of a hybrid model. I don't know what Marx would think about that, but we'll never know because he's gone. So that's page 617. Read that primary source. I think there's a section there from one of his communist manifestos. Read that because it's interesting, and socialism is still a thing that we grapple with philosophically in this country, and so I want you to know what that is and how that started. And it all started with Marx in the mid 1800s. And then finally, page 618 starts to talk about the Americas. So it starts to talk about U.S. and really this sort of final push of moving the Native Americans farther out west, and really the final blow to Native Americans. And I think the book spends a little bit too much time on this because there are Native American rebellions or revolts, if you will, but the Anglo-Saxon white Americans really were looking at to either eliminate Native Americans or have Native Americans assimilate into our society, and we're talking two totally different cultures. So Native Americans, they didn't think that you should be able to own land. That land belongs to everybody. So it's a major tenet of capitalism is private ownership of land. Native American culture, there's nothing like that. So it was a foregone conclusion, I think, that culturally the Native Americans were eventually going to be, wiped out or moved to reservations, or, what actually happened. And hindsight's easy, of course, but I think when you read through, and there's another primary source on page 621. You can read about the differences between Native American culture and Anglo-white American culture, and the differences are pretty substantial. So there's that. Lastly, there's a section about rebellion in India. Just a reminder, in the last chapter, the British, the East India Company, really started to take over India and controlled India, and there's a big rebellion. Unsuccessful, where the Indians try to take back their country, which results in, I would say, a stronger British rule under Queen Victoria. So read through that so you know what's going on in India. Of course, British rule in India is going to end as we get into subsequent chapters, but right now in the 1800s, the British are still in control. So you should know that. And if you're familiar with Indian culture at all, the English law, a lot of English institutions are in place, and the reason is because England colonized and basically ran the country for quite some time. So make sure you read the chapter conclusion on page 628. It gives you a kind of a good wrap-up of a complicated chapter. And then finally, make sure you know what Marxism is, be able to contrast it with capitalism, make sure you know what a theocracy is, and be able to contrast that with democracy. And next week we'll move on to chapter 17. So thanks a lot for all of your hard work. Be safe, have a great day, and I'll see you again next week. Thank you.